Okay, so the first key concept in period 5 is industrialization. So we'll start there. Okay, so industrialization fundamentally altered the production of goods around the world. So it not only changed how the goods were produced and consumed, but it also changed what was considered a good. So you were moving from the raw products to actually manufactured goods. But it also had far reaching effects on the global economy, social relations, and culture. Although it is common to speak of a quote unquote industrial revolution, the process of industrialization was more gradual that unfolded over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, eventually becoming a whole global process instead of just a local process. So let's look at the rise of it. The rise of the industrial production. So, a lot of factors led to this rise of industrial production. You've got Europe's location on the Atlantic Ocean, makes it a prime candidate. Geographical distribution of coal, iron, and timber. The countries that industrialized the fastest had large supplies of coal, iron, and timber to help supply them. You've got European demographic changes, where Europe's population in 1700 was about 100 million people. Europe's population in 1900 was about 400 million people. So it doubled every 50 years. So with that, you have a rising urbanization, so the growth of the cities. And you have improved agricultural productivity thanks to crop rotation to keep the grounds nice and fertile. You have seed drills, you have improved plows, the enclosure movement to help fence off lands. You've got selective breeding, only breeding specific crops instead of every crop. You have a national agricultural market, land conversion to specific crops. You have abundant waterways and new fertilizers too. You also have the legal protection of private property. Thanks to the Enlightenment and the enclosure movement, life, liberty, and property are highly sought after things. You have the abundance of rivers and canals that helped for transportation. You've got access to foreign resources. Europe controlled about 40% of the Earth's population, which is incredible. Come to think about how tiny Europe is. And you have the accumulation of capital. 200 years of colonialism led to a heck of a lot of money sitting there for Europe to handle. So you've got all of these things contributing to the rise of industrial production. So the development of machines made it possible to exploit vast new resources of energy that were stored in fossil fuels like coal and oil. The fossil fuels revolution greatly increased the energy available to these human societies. And examples of these machines that required fossil fuels would be like steam engines. You still need coal to heat it up, get the steam. And the internal combustion engine, which is like the precursor to car vehicles. Factory systems. So you have it concentrated labor in a single location. Remember, prior to this, you had the cottage industry where the farmer would bring the goods into their own home, and in that home, they would create the product. Now, instead of the individual farmers making the individual products, factories made it a whole lot faster and a whole lot more efficient. So it led to an increasing degree of specialization of labor in each of these different factories because you had specific machines to do specific jobs. Okay, the spread of the Industrial Revolution. As these new methods became more common in parts of Northwestern Europe, they spread to other parts of Europe and the United States, Russia, and Japan. Thanks to the steamboat, the railroads, all of those things helped to spread these new inventions and the Industrial Revolution. The second Industrial Revolution as we know it, in the second half of the 19th century, this led to new methods in the production of steel, chemicals, electricity, precision machinery. The biggest thing to remember about the second Industrial Revolution is chemicals and steel, and electricity along with it, because those are your major key factors of the second Industrial Revolution as opposed to the original one in Europe. You also have a need for raw materials. So in order to make all these products in these factories, you gotta have raw materials. So increased food supplies were needed for an increased population in those urban areas. They don't just stop eating now that they've moved to the cities, which led to a growth of export economies around the world. Who do you think were the export economies? the colonies. So they specialized in mass producing natural resources, and their profits from the raw materials were used to purchase the finished goods. So think about your cotton, think about your corn, your wheat, all of those different things. So pictured there, you see cotton on the left, you see rubber trees on second from the left. You see palm tree there for oil, and you also see sugar. Sugar was absolutely important. So we'll talk some more about raw materials on the next slide. So raw materials, you got cotton. So that fluffy thing that helps make clothes that are nice and soft and sheets that are nice and soft, great material maker. You got rubber. So those trees are tapped in the top right to get the rubber out of the trees. Palm oil, you can see there that's being poured. That helps too. Like that's found in so many different things. Sugar makes things sweet. You can see the sugar cane below the palm oil. Wheat is right next to the sugar cane. And obviously that goes into quite a few things we eat. Meat, I don't think you need a picture for meats. Guano, that is bird poop that was used as fertilizer. That is a massive pile of guano on the bottom right. So yes, that is a big giant pile of bird poop, and that was considered a massive fertilizer in this time period, and it was highly sought after. You also had your metals that were looked for raw materials. Global manufacturing. So you got the rapid development of steam-powered industrial production in Europe and the US, which contributed to the increase of these regions' share of the global manufacturing. While the Middle Eastern and Asian countries then continued to produce manufactured goods, these regions shared in global manufacturing declined. So they ended up producing a lot less globally than they had before. If you look at this, you can see the GDP, gross domestic product, that each of the nations were producing during the Industrial Revolution and before the Industrial Revolution and after the Industrial Revolution. So you can see the height of China, India, and the Middle East was definitely prior to or at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and then it kind of tapered off as the Industrial Revolution really took off for the US and Western Europe, and really hasn't stopped since then. So major illustrative examples of decline of Middle Eastern and Asian share, shipbuilding in India and Southeast Asia happened. Ironworks were occurring in India, and textile production was still happening in India and Egypt, but otherwise that was their specialization of like manufacturing. It didn't go beyond that. So the AP College Board, they suggest that you do know at least about those things, that's what they were focused on there in those regions. The rapid development of industrial production contributed to the decline of economically productive, agriculturally based economies. So a lot of these colonial areas, unfortunately, their economies tanked because they were focused on agricultural economies or not really a whole lot of manufacturing. So new consumer products or markets, you have this increase in productivity caused by the industrial production encouraged the industrialized states, so your Western Europe, your United States, to seek out new consumer markets. The British and the French attempted to open up the Chinese markets during the 19th century. That's when they're fighting for the spheres of influence, and then ultimately getting the open door policy for their finished goods. The global economy of the 19th century expanded dramatically from the previous period. Why? Well, because of increased exchanges of raw materials and finished goods in most parts of the world, and some commodities gave merchants and companies based in Europe and the United States a distinct economic advantage. So they were producing goods that were more expensive at a lower cost, and they were benefiting from it, even though other places might be providing the raw materials at not as much of a cost as not as much of a benefit for them. So commodities that contributed to this, like opium. So that was produced in the Middle East or in South Asia, and then it was exported to China. Think the British. And that got them rich quick. Cotton growth also in South Asia, Egypt, and the Caribbean or North America, and then it was exported to Great Britain and other European countries to be manufactured. So a big thing in American history is the phrase cotton is king. During the 1800s in the United States, in the Deep South, cotton ruled everything. Cotton was king because it made them so rich. Palm oil, that was produced in sub-Saharan Africa and then exported to European countries for minimal benefit to sub-Saharan Africa and great benefit to the European countries. You have specialized and limited metals that were needed for industrial production. You have a global demand for gold, silver, and diamonds because they were obviously seen as forms of wealth. And this led to the development of extensive mining centers like copper mines in Mexico and gold and diamond mines in South Africa. A great movie that still talks about the modern struggle with diamonds in Africa is Blood Diamond. It definitely talks about how deadly and dangerous the diamond trade is within Africa. You have ideological inspiration for the economic changes, the development of capitalism with Adam Smith and his book The Wealth of Nations in 1776-ish. And you also have the creation of classical liberalism by John Stuart Mill. As for globalization, you've got the global nature of trade and production. So now you have large-scale transnational businesses that relied on various financial instruments. And some examples of those we'll talk about in just a second. So United Fruit Company, that is based in the US, but operated in Central America because Central America was able to grow the fruit, whether it was bananas or pineapples or whatever it was. The same thing also happened with Dole Plantation prior to Hawaii being annexed. Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, or HSBC, was founded by British bankers in the colony of Hong Kong and is still one of the major banks in the world, but it was run by the British bankers. Financial instruments like the stock markets, insurance, the gold standard. So the gold standard helped to keep the standard of money based on a fixed quantity of gold. And limited liability companies, or LLCs, those were more flexible than like your basic corporation, and it protected personal property if the business failed. So say that I had a business and it happened to go bankrupt. They couldn't come after, and I had an LLC, they couldn't come after my own personal property. They couldn't come after my house or my car or any of that stuff because my business failed. That was the nice protection of a limited liability company. Major developments in transportation and communication during this period include railroads, steamships, telegraphs, and canals. And all of those definitely help with transportation and communication and helping to push further this globalized economy. During this time, you also have organization of workers. So in the industrialized states, they organize themselves in like unions to improve working conditions, to limit their hours, and to gain higher wages. Others opposed industrialist treatments of workers by promoting an alternative vision of society, which would be like Marxism. And we'll talk about some of those alternative visions of society. So a utopian society. It was a philosophy that was introduced by the Frenchman Charles Fourier, and he hoped to create humane alternatives to the industrial capitalism. And to do that, you had to build self-sustaining communities whose inhabitants would work cooperatively. It's socialism, in essence, where the society is working together and everything. You have a movement today of dystopian novels. So like the utopian society went wrong, basically. So that's taking off of that idea in futuristic terms. Anarchism is opposition to any form of government whatsoever, and it says that all governments should be abolished. And then, of course, Marxism was created by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and that holds that humans' actions and institutions are economically determined, and that class struggle is needed in order to create historical change, and that capitalism would ultimately be superseded by socialism and then communism. Communism was the end of their cycle, and they saw it as inevitable. In Asia, so in Qing China and the Ottoman Empire, some members of the government resisted the economic change, and they attempted to maintain their pre-industrial forms of economic production, while other members of the Qing and Ottoman governments led reforms to the imperial policies, which we'll talk about in just a second. So the TANZIMAT movement in the Ottoman Empire. You have reorganizations of the sultans after Mahmud in 1839 to 1876 is when he ruled, and they rooted out long-standing widespread corruption in the government. So you now have secular schools under the Sultan instead of religious-based schools. They built more roads, canals, and railroads. The sultans codified the Ottoman laws, so created one major law set for the Ottoman Empire instead of little laws everywhere. And they created new ones, which included a commercial code and a penal code, penalty, penal, punishment. You had the Ottoman Reform Edict in 1856, which updated the legal system and declared equality for all men in education, government, and justice, regardless of your religion or your ethnicity. And that also regulated the millets, or the separate legal courts that were established by different religious communities. So the central government became less influenced by religion and more focused on being secular. And it didn't achieve religious equality in the Ottoman Empire, but it had wide effects in the areas of military and education. So it's seen as largely positive for the Ottoman Empire during this time. You had the self-strengthening movement in the Qing Empire from 1861 to 1895. They saw it as the way to fix internal and external problems in China, kind of as a response to the Taiping Rebellion. They hoped to strengthen China in its competition with foreign powers by advancing its military technology and its readiness by training Chinese artisans, so individual workers, in the manufacture of items for shipyards and arsenals. And the French and the British advisors helped the Chinese reform efforts. Now, the Chinese were able to repay their debts and participate in trade, which ultimately became an advantage for the Europeans. But they set up a diplomatic corps and a customs service to help collect taxes on imports and exports, so the Qing government was trying to adapt to this new industrial globalized world. Their strategy was to put modern technology on top of Chinese tradition, rather than to create major change in their culture or political ideas. Ultimately, it didn't work out so well for them. The Qing Empire fell only a few years later, but it was their efforts at industrializing and reforming. So state-sponsored visions of industrialization occurred in a small number of states. So you have the economic reforms of Meiji Japan, you have the development of factories and railroads in Tsarist Russia, and Muhammad Ali in Egypt. So in Meiji Japan, 1868 to 1912, you have the abolishment of feudalism in 1868 by the Charter Oath, and then reorganizing Japan into the prefectures, which were districts that were administered by the central government rather than ruled by daimyos. They borrowed Western ideas about justice, like the establishment of equality before the law and getting rid of cruel and unusual punishments. They established a constitutional monarchy, and you had the emperor exercising political power and overseeing the foreign policy, and then the Diet, or the Congress, if you want to look at it that way, focused on domestic policy. Then they remodeled the military, also based off the Prussian model. They established a postal service. They created a new educational system, also modeled after Western systems. They promoted industrialization and then financed it by the Japanese government and foreign investors. They started a railroad network in 1869, employing British engineers, so similar to what the Qing dynasty did. You had samurai resistance at first, and they did try to rebel, but they ultimately lost out in the 1870s, and they were the main victims of Japan's rapid modernization. But otherwise, Japan modernized pretty well. Muhammad Ali in Egypt, he developed a cotton textile industry there. So the Ottoman Empire had competition with France and Britain right up there in the Mediterranean. There was government control of cotton production, its export, and the textile factories in Egypt. In Cairo, factories were made to produce armaments, military arms. Dozens of small shops were turning out locks, bolts of cloth, and other parts of uniforms and weaponry to create this industry there. And in Alexandria, facilities to build ships so that Egypt could have a navy and be more modernized. So Muhammad Ali worked on modernizing and industrializing Egypt as it was at that point in time. Okay, so response to criticisms of industrial global capitalism. So some governments tried to mitigate the negative effects of industrial capitalism by promoting reforms. In Germany, you had state pensions or retirement and public health under Otto von Bismarck. In Britain, you have the expansion of suffrage or the right to vote. In 1884, you have the extension to about 60% of adult males. By 1918, you have all men 21 and older were allowed to vote, and about 40% of women got the right to vote then. And then full equal suffrage for men and women in 1928. And then in many nation states, you have public education. And that was a major, major achievement of this time period, was public education. Now for social organization, you've got new social classes, including the middle class and the industrial working class coming about during this period. The family dynamics and gender roles and demographics changed. So you've got different women are going to fill in the jobs where men are leaving to go out of the home to work in the factories. And you've got just the family dynamics in general changing because of those things. And rapid urbanization often led to unsanitary conditions in the factories and where the working class lived in cities. You often had tenements and just unclean conditions whatsoever. Like the public sewage was not exactly an idea until later in this period. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to social cultural issues.